Okay, hi. My name is Jessica Douglas. Like she said, I want to thank you all for coming in, by the way. I know it's early. I know y'all made it, so I really do appreciate it. Thank you to Olivia. I really appreciate this opportunity to kind of come up here and share all this stuff with you, because it's a rare occasion that happens. You know, archivists don't really have like a speaking platform. We don't share things. We're kind of introverts, and we just like hole up in our offices. So this is wonderful. And thank you to Maryland Art Place, to everybody that is volunteering today, to the Contemporary, for everybody that kind of worked behind the scenes on this, for Doobies for providing the coffee and the food. A lot went into this that like I didn't even see, that you guys didn't see, and it's really impressive. So thank you. It's a really cool thing. So who are you? Because half of this, like it's not like I'm out there all day, every day. Like I said, my name is Jess Douglas. I'm a reference archivist at the Maryland State Archives, and as far as what a reference archivist does, we're the ones that are working with the public to kind of answer questions. If you come into the Maryland State Archives, we're helping you to retrieve certain items. If you want to look at an old record, I might be the one bringing you that old record, that gigantic old book of tax logs from Montgomery County that nobody else really wants to look at, but you want to look at it. I will get that for you. And I'm also on the advisory board of the Preserve the Baltimore Uprising 2015 Digital Archives, which is a wonderful online user-submitted catalog archives of photos, videos, oral histories. We have a lot of film clips that were created by really anybody can submit an item, and it's an ongoing archives. It's a project that was started by Denise Maringolo of UMBC and Joe Trapea, who is here somewhere, I don't know. Joe Trapea, who works at the Maryland Historical Society. They came up with this really great idea to kind of provide an outlet or a source or a repository, basically, for all the items that related to the uprising. And it's one of those things where otherwise a lot of this could end up getting lost. So it's really great that they kind of thought on their feet and just pushed that opportunity. All right, I hope that, yes. I was afraid that was passcoded. Okay, so about me. I'm gonna make this really generic. I like history. I like reading. Oh, join our book club. We have a book club at the Crown. It's a wonderful thing. We meet basically like every month or 6 weeks, something like that. We're about to pick a second book, so if you wanna join our book club, do that. Very amateur photography, because as of right now, I have one digital SLR that has a broken battery and an iPhone. And really, you can do a lot with an iPhone, so it's kind of wonderful to have that. I also like walking, exploring, and observing things. And I also really like baking, candy, and sugar. I'm just gonna put that all on one line. That's very important to me. Things that I don't like: cold weather, mean people, social injustice, and inequality. And I swear I'm not 12 years old. This is really like actually things that I do like and dislike. They occupy much of my time. So I basically, when Olivia asked me to do this, she first asked me for my email address, which was kind of funny because like, I'm 26, I use my email address for work, and otherwise I check it, but I don't really give it out to anybody. So it was like, all right, I'm such a product of my generation that I was like, oh, this could be big. I don't know what this is. Like, this could be like bad big, but I don't think somebody's gonna email me something like that. So like, this is gonna be big. And since I use my email in such a professional capacity, like I check it regularly, I respond to it in a really kind of formal way. I know that people that are older than me can actually read email and it makes sense to them. Sometimes the reply all doesn't really work for people, but like, It still seems to confound some people that that's an option. But when I read Olivia's message and I kind of saw this invitation and that the theme would be moments, I was kind of having like a mind moment. Like, then my mind sort of went blank, and I couldn't think of like how I would even define something like a moment. And there are so many different ways to define a moment, you know, whether it's a literal definition of the word itself or a formal definition, a definition that relates to like physics or statistics or something like that, and I am not good at either of those things. So I wasn't really sure how I would define something like a moment. And then I started thinking about how we relate to the term in everyday life. And then I realized that obviously life really is just a gigantic series of moments that you're kind of interconnecting, and you're trying to find like that path between moments. But why is it important for us to keep these moments and to really try and preserve our moments? So again, product of my generation, I went ahead and Googled the word moment and looked up a Merriam-Webster definition of that. There are 7 different definitions. Some of them have A's and B's, and I immediately discredited 6A, B, 7A, and B because those are related, again, to math and science, not my strong suit. So, oh, cut it down. Look how much better that looks. And so then I started looking at words that kind of popped out to me. Oh, shit. I don't know how to get back to that. All right. I'm going to this one. That's the one that I want. Okay. So I started looking at things and trying to figure out like what really stood out to me. And it was things like a minute portion or a point of time. So a point of time, a brief period of time. And then I looked at 2B. And I was like, oh, a time of excellence or conspicuousness. That's really kind of cool. Like, and importance or influence or effect. And then 5, a stage in historical or logical development. So I started thinking something like a point or period in time resonates. You know, like 2B is really when I started to kind of like click. And finally, combined with 3 and 5, the importance or influence and effect, and a stage in historical or logical development, we're really starting to kind of build a foundation for what, or from what can be a very abstract term. You know, moments are big, but how do they actually relate to you? And why does it matter? You know, why should we even keep our moments momentous? So I'm not just an archivist, I'm not just a history enthusiast, but I'm also someone who studied politics, and I kind of remain actively interested and relatively involved in politics and political activity. And additionally, you know, being a Black woman means that I and many people here can relate to being part of a marginalized group, and we're automatically coming from a historically marginalized, underrepresented demographic. So speaking generally, I mean, there have been several instances in recent history that have motivated historians, archivists, organizers, politicians, and activists to kind of come together to ensure that the most accurate parts of our history, like this history, are maintained, and that it's told from the perspective of those who experience these moments in time and who've actually been most closely associated with these events. History has, for centuries, been documented by and for those in power. So before we even get to the election, I'm just gonna let that settle in for a second. How many of you learned about like the Civil War in any history class in elementary, middle, or high school? All right, that's most people, not necessarily everyone. I don't know, I'm sorry that our history classes have failed you. But how many of you were actually taught that the Civil War was like fought for states' rights? Okay, so some people kind of, if we remember it. I had one teacher who swore by the fact that states' rights were the only reason that the Civil War was taught, you know, and I automatically questioned something like that. So, because I remember learning about the Civil War and thinking, it sounds like this is kind of because of slavery, guys. I don't know, like maybe slavery, maybe territory, something like that. And my teachers, at least prior to high school, would always say, well, it's states' rights. And I was like, yeah, but don't you mean like states' rights to own slaves? Like, I don't, and to claim land and territories and things like that. But these are the oversimplifications that end up being kind of preserved in textbooks. And whether, I mean, it's good that we're discussing these things at least. Like, it kind of doesn't mean that we're learning the whole truth, or at least I didn't until I actually began to study history in college, or high school and college. And once you really begin to uncover the truth, you see how history really does sort of repeat itself, and that we can learn a lot from the mistakes that cultures have already made in the past. Now, regardless of whether it's kind of a significant moment or something mundane, we can gather information from all of these random moments that we can collect together. And today, advancements in technology now allow everyday citizens to accurately and easily capture and document a lot of this information. I mean, we can share almost anything with anybody across the world. So, I mean, this is sometimes a somewhat overwhelming concept, and because really, at least it's just me, there are a lot of selfies out there. And it's something that I think about where maybe there are too many selfies, but where do you draw the line? But it's also our first opportunity to share even a selfie with anybody across the world. So, getting back to this, we have to talk about this election. Now, the first time that I spoke about something like this publicly, it was 2 days before the election. It was the 5th of November. We still kind of had like a smidgen of hope, maybe, that something positive could come out of the election. It was already kind of a disaster from that whole, like the entire 2016 election. But this is obviously a big moment in our history. It's probably bigger than a moment. It's probably just an era of some sort. But at least right now, it's a really big moment. And this is an example of when archiving has been absolutely crucial with regards to preserving the integrity of history, politics, and journalism. So, like I said, first time I gave sort of a presentation about this sort of thing, it was November 5th, and it was at the Mid-Atlantic Regional Archives Conference. And yes, that exists. That's an actual conference. That's a real thing. And this was 2 days before the general election. Then the following Tuesday, we realized that that was the end result of the election. Within minutes of Trump being inaugurated, for instance, I'm just going to let the whole November to January time period kind of settle in. There were full web pages taken down from the issues page of the White House website, and they were about things like climate change and the LGBTQI community. Climate change and equal rights are concerns that really aren't going away anytime soon. I mean, Donald Trump could possibly, by the way, be one of the most accurate meteorologists we have, because it is 70 degrees outside, and it is February 24th. Just let that sink in. So he's trying to hide climate change from us. There's also the fact that within 30 days of being in office, Trump issued an executive order barring refugees from 7 Muslim-majority countries from entering the U.S. for the next 4 months, and altogether barring citizens from entering the country for the next 3 months. Now, federal judges, lawyers, and activists across the country had to work tirelessly to prove that the executive order was unconstitutional and to protect those refugees and other immigrants from being deported and otherwise pushed into really adverse conditions. And as recently as yesterday, Trump revoked a guidance from the Obama administration that protected trans students in federally funded public schools. Trans students are disproportionately targeted for discrimination, bullying, and abuse, both inside and out of schools. And now they no longer have this guidance to fall back on. And again, those in power are trying to hide the truth, this time literally by hiding certain pieces of information from publicly accessible outlets. And I'm sorry to get all political, but it's actually happening. So with every day, our ability to maintain a sense of integrity and honesty in our government is questioned. And with every day, this very fundamental civil rights, the very fundamental civil rights that American citizens are entitled to, are also being questioned. So how can we establish a standard for transparency, honesty, and integrity, and carry on comfortably knowing that our government hasn't blindfolded us? And how do we as everyday citizens keep our stories from being overshadowed, about our pages being actually hidden? Now, one step that we can take towards preserving our sense of integrity and our sense of honesty is to make sure that stories being told, that our moments are being preserved, and that history is actually told by the perspective of those living in the moment. So we see that young people tended to vote more often for Hillary Clinton. And generally, younger people have increasingly leaned toward the Democratic, liberal, or left-leaning candidates. There's also, this is the second half of the election results. You can see that things kind of evened out by the time you reach a certain age, but there's also the fact that predominantly the marginalized groups, once again, are not voting for a more Republican candidate. And as far as gender goes, there was a slight increase in the number of female voters that voted more for the left-leaning candidate. And finally, in the LGBTQ community, there was also a large majority voting not for Donald Trump. So what'd you notice? History has, and I'm sorry again to push this on you all, but history has for centuries been documented by and for those in power. And the same groups that have historically been in power, non-marginalized groups, were more likely to vote for Trump. That's why we need to share our moments. So what can we do? There are advancements in technology that allow everyday citizens to document and share almost anything. So for the first time, we're able to tell and preserve our own history. Now, we can get into slightly more fun things. This is Michelle Obama wants our people, our young people, to know that they matter and that they actually belong. So it really is important for us to ensure that we keep our version of this history intact. So, a couple of sleep statistics. This is about smartphones. Particularly for my age bracket, 18 to 29-year-olds, our smartphones have become about as essential to us as basic articles of clothing. Now what that says is 90% of 18 to 29-year-olds say they sleep with their phone in or right next to their bed. Now, yeah, that's a lot of people. And go ahead, we all admit it. It's right there. You know, it's our alarm clocks. It's our life force, whatever. It's not a big deal. So that's the source information. Now, according to a Bank of America Mobile Consumer Report, nearly 3/4 of Americans, that's 71% of Americans who own smartphones, sleep with them, either by keeping their phones on a nightstand by their bed, in the bed, or for 3% of people holding it in their hands when they sleep. And for about 1/3 of smartphone-wielding Americans, it's the first thing they think about in the morning. Now, for comparison, only 10% of people think about their significant other first thing in the morning. Yeah. Now, there's a bias to many polls like this, but regardless, it's obvious that this increasing trend tends toward a greater reliance upon using smartphones in many aspects of life. Now, it might seem like overkill, but there is one silver lining about eye-opening statistics like that. And it means that we're toting around one of the most powerful, practical resources for capturing and archiving moments in our lives. So, the Baltimore Uprising. That's kind of why I started getting interested in all of this. Major events today, tragedies, social movements, protests, uprisings. They're constantly appearing in news headlines, status updates, Twitter feeds, and across multiple forms of social media. It's almost an overload of information, and I think we kind of experienced that overload, especially in the last several months. But the primary sources, i.e. photographs, videos, video clips, audio clips, oral histories, all of these capture our attention in totally revolutionary ways, even though they really are some of the most historically accurate ways of preserving information. And this is the first time in history when I can see a photograph taken seconds ago in New York City, then scroll down on a Twitter feed and see a photograph taken in Syria, and then a video clip that was taken in Russia or something, all without leaving Baltimore or Annapolis when I'm sitting on my computer at work. There is an abundant need for proper archiving of these primary sources, especially as we progress more towards quick, instant, and disposable. So particularly during a major event, when everything happens at rapid speed and many people involved are kind of required to make these really quick and rash decisions, there's not always an immediate thought or concern for properly documenting these moments for archival purposes. Why would you think about archiving things when you're in the middle of a protest or an uprising? But particularly during a major event, when everything happens at that rash moment, it's kind of important to prioritize how best to react to the actual event. But there is a need and desire for accuracy, transparency, and concrete documentation that can be referred back to, because people do actually research these things, and people can learn from all of this 5 years, 10 years, 50 years down the line. So, starting on the Freddie Gray thing. As our culture gravitates more towards a born digital world, and by that I mean primary sources created digitally rather than paper-based sources, the shift towards digital archives is more than natural. Our cell phones, for instance, capture certain information when a photograph is taken: the time, the date, the location. Now, we can also make our phones include things like a title, the phone settings. You can tag something, you can label something to organize the photos, the videos, the information, the audio segments. Anything that you're really trying to save on your computer can be used for archival purposes. Don't let your phone use it against you. Our cell phones, for instance, when they're doing this tag thing, the technology and the apps that we're using every day, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all of these things are kind of archiving all of this information. They're essentially archiving the majority of the media for us. It's just a matter for us to kind of take all of this information and make sure that the media survives with or without these apps, these pieces of technology. We want to collect things like the metadata from all of this information, but not necessarily rely on something like Twitter to access it. So going to this photograph, this was the press conference that Marilyn Mosby held. On April 12th, 2015, Freddie Gray, a 25-year-old man from Baltimore, was arrested by Baltimore police. I'm sure that a lot of you are actually aware of this, but I have to go into it. After running from uniformed officers, he was dragged by these officers, placed in a police vehicle, and transported to a city jail. So while in police custody, he showed signs of serious injury and became unconscious. Police called for emergency medical assistance, and Gray was transported to a hospital where he died a week later from a spinal injury. Okay. When both local and federal authorities opened a series of formal investigations, the 6 officers closely involved in his arrest and transport were charged with several crimes, including murder, assault, and manslaughter. And his injury was the catalyst for a protest that began on April 18th outside the Western District Police Station, and his death on the 19th sparked more protests across the city. So, the protests that occurred afterwards were widespread, sometimes involving thousands of citizens of Baltimore. His funeral on April 27th was the catalyst for large-scale conflict that involved hundreds of students virally spreading the message about purging from their high school on the west side of Baltimore. Law enforcement obtained a copy of this viral text and shut down several key bus lines and the depot itself, which left many students stranded after school without the normal ways to travel home. So the students began reacting in frustration to these preemptive actions, and some of the reactions became increasingly violent. This escalated into an overnight protest in which citizens of Baltimore, many of whom were underage students that had been stranded, protested, broke into businesses, damaged city streets and buildings, and otherwise reacted to the police hostility and to Gray's death. Streets were closed, the National Guard was called to Baltimore, and Mayor Stephanie Rawlings Blake enforced a nightly curfew that I think most of us remember. Over 100 citizens were arrested during this time. And this late April, early May collective period of time is now referred to as the Baltimore Uprising. So, There's already kind of evidence of the historical significance of events like this, the Black Lives Matter movement, for instance. Baltimore is just one list in a list of cities where citizens began voicing their frustrations about an ongoing problem with police brutality, specifically police brutality towards African Americans. This is a photo from another Black Lives Matter protest in New York City. Now, a hashtag, Black Lives Matter, was created by Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi in response to the shooting death of Trayvon Martin at the hands of George Zimmerman. It went viral. It's expanded into an international activist movement that encompasses 30 local chapters across the country campaigning against systemic racism and racism towards Black people, including, but not limited to, police brutality, racial profiling, and inequality in the criminal justice system. And they've organized protests across the country in response to the deaths of several Black people who have died while in police custody, including Tamir Rice, Freddie Gray, Sandra Bland, Alton Sterling, and Philando Castile. Their use of viral campaigning has been replicated both online through social media and in real life. In movements like this, in part because it's an easy to remember hashtag or short phrase that's able to be succinctly expressed on a point. It's easy to chant in protest, and it can be duplicated on signs, t-shirts, online, in short form, Twitter, and hashtag. So Baltimore's place in this period of ongoing unrest is now kind of integral to our history on many levels, but it's important to note that the 50th anniversary of several key events that occurred in 1968, including the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, the 1968 general election, and the 68 riots in several cities across the country, including Baltimore, are now being referred to and researched more now than ever. So it's easy to kind of draw comparisons between the riots in '68 in Baltimore and the protests and riots of 2015. And the closer we get to this 50th anniversary, the more we have researchers, historians, civil rights activists, and organizers reverting back to these events. So I can only imagine how the Baltimore uprising of 2015 will be referenced and researched in 2065, which is a major motivator for actually making sure that this media and information is well preserved and maintained. So, the Preserve the Baltimore Uprising 2015. I'm gonna do like a quick little summary of this little website. It's actually not a little website by any means. It's a digital repository, and like I said, it's used as a means of actually collecting a lot of the primary sources that resulted from the Baltimore Uprising. As far as approval criteria, everything that is submitted will eventually end up on there. The third-party use, you retain the rights to all of these items. You can browse things in a really kind of interesting way by tag. You can search things through basically a really simple search bar. There's also a really streamlined way of looking at the actual information once you get down to each subject. And there's geotagging, which is one of my favorite sort of items about this whole project. There's also a lot of videos that have been contributed by Wide-Angle Youth Media. And I mean, these guys are really talented filmmakers, and they're young. So as far as benefits goes, accuracy, organization, transparency, and a lot of the technology that we're using is mostly free. You can get free apps to do almost anything that a pay-for app would actually do. There are some consequences to using things like social media. There's trouble with law enforcement. It can lead to incrimination or self-incrimination. Let me see. Skipping ahead. So for instance, things can be used in the wrong hands, and participants now kind of have to be concerned about what's seen at the event as well as what's seen after the event, or what can be reviewed after the event. There are some moral and ethical issues as far as things like taking a photograph and posting it online, and whether or not that's actually permissible, whether or not an age restriction is actually something that needs to be put into play. There's also concerns about the lifespan of social media apps and the lifespan of the technology itself. How many of you have a smartphone? How many of you have a laptop? And how many of you have replaced it in the last 3 years? That's a lot of people. And a major concern is whether or not these items will actually survive. And that's one of our main incentives towards actually getting these things online and into a central repository. There are still plenty of unanswered questions about all of this, whether or not things will be permanent, whether they'll maintain or will be able to maintain accessibility, and there's also a concern about whether or not we're being oversaturated with this sort of information and where to draw the line as far as filtering things. I still have the concern about there being too many selfies, but that is just me. So as far as getting past the uprising, I have sort of like a code that I like to follow. Embrace the moment. Don't focus on the actual experience that you're supposed to focus on the actual experience. Don't focus on the image or the end result, the video that you're trying to get. There are a lot of people that end up kind of focusing more on seemingly bypassing things like the general concern for humanity in terms of trying to get a photograph. And hopefully people will actually be able to enjoy the moment themselves. Respect your surroundings and the others that you're sharing the environment with. When you go into a random place, don't act like you own it. You're still kind of a guest. You're being welcomed into a new environment, and it takes a lot of respect. Know your rights, but also know your responsibilities. Do not let law enforcement incriminate you in ways that they shouldn't. I'm going to whisper that because I don't want to get arrested. Be prepared. Smartphones can be very useful in that respect. And read signs, read the environment around you. And I'm talking about not just like reading words, but read the situation. If you feel uncomfortable somewhere, don't push yourself out there. But it is a very useful way of going about, protesting, demonstrating, and really just making sure that our history is actually being maintained. Support your local journalists, artists, marginalized groups, support the NEA, support the NEH. These are all things that are actually underfunded tremendously, and I'm sure that all of you are aware of this, but every day there's a threat to every single one of these groups. So it needs to, the NEA and the NEH, for instance, we need to fund these things, and we need to support programs like this. That's it. Thank you.